Hey guys, Dave here, and this is Hellblade, Senua's Sacrifice. It's the latest title from Ninja Theory, and it tackles the sensitive subject of mental illness through a tense and often surreal action game. Powered by Unreal Engine 4, elements such as post-processing and dynamic lighting are used to convey Senua's constantly shifting state of mind. Sound also plays a key part here too, with binaural audio used to project whispered voices into the player's ear to simulate hearing voices that aren't really there. The effect requires earphones to work, but is handled superbly throughout the game to both immerse and irritate the player. It's an interesting concept, but overall I think that the subject matter is handled respectfully, and the result is a game that certainly takes us by surprise, and in a good way. From an artistic standpoint then, Hellblade exceeds our expectations, but how well does the game hold up on the PlayStation 4? Well, to be honest, it's here that things could be a little better. While PS4 Pro is given several options for enhancing the visuals for owners of 4K and 1080p TVs, the standard experience on both base hardware and the Pro, which targets 30 frames per second, just isn't as smooth as it could be. There's noticeable judder and some unevenness in the controls. So what exactly are we looking at then? Well, like with many titles this generation, Hellblade operates using a dynamic resolution on PS4. Base hardware comes in at native 1080p, and for the most part we didn't notice any visible dips in resolution when going through our footage. That said, heavy use of post-processing already creates quite a soft image, so any minor dips in resolution are generally going to be very hard to pinpoint. As such, I feel that image quality isn't overly impacted by the use of dynamic resolution here, and generally appears pretty solid on the base PS4 all round, with good use of anti-aliasing, preventing obvious edge artifacts from appearing. And besides, the overall soft, filmic tone works quite well for this type of game. With regards to PS4 Pro, Ninja Theory supports a range of different modes, allowing the user to prioritize either image quality or performance. There's the obvious boost in resolution up to 1440p for those with a 4K screen, a 60fps option for higher frame rates, and lastly there's also downsampling for those with 1080p TVs. Whichever mode you happen to choose, dynamic resolution scaling is always in play. The idea here is to prioritize keeping frame rates at the desired level, whether that be 30fps or 60 frames per second. And on that note, it's also worth pointing out that across the two versions, resolution and frame rate are the only differences here. There's no other additional improvements with regards to effects work or core assets on PS4 Pro. It's simply down to how smooth and how sharp the image looks. The default mode on PS4 Pro sees the game targeting 30 frames per second, while hitting a maximum resolution of 1440p. I say maximum because the resolution is dynamically adjusted according to rendering load, and this means that we get anywhere between native 1080p and 1440p during gameplay. Although curiously, resolution shifts do tend to occur when there's not much happening on screen, suggesting that the game is pretty demanding even outside of action heavy moments. This does mean that the image quality gains over base hardware is kind of limited. When hitting the full 1440p, the presentation on Pro does indeed look better than on standard PS4 when viewed on a 4K screen. As with other titles that render at 1440p and then upscale to 4K, fine details and edges can appear quite fuzzy, and the results are definitely a step down from games that checkerboard up to 1800p, or even the likes of For Honor, which renders natively at 1440p before using temporal injection to hit 4K. Here I feel that playing in 1080p on a full HD screen is maybe the better option, especially when using the Pro, as the game can downsample from 1440p to improve image quality over base hardware. That said, the soft filmic nature of the game means that the 1440p presentation can hold up quite well, though when the resolution does drop below, closer to 1080p, things don't really appear that different to base hardware, and the improvements there become a bit more disappointing. On the face of it, it seems like Ninja Theory might have simply increased resolution on Pro until hitting performance limits. By that I mean until performance started to drop below the level of base PS4, essentially limiting the jump to 1440p and forcing the use of a dynamic frame buffer. And it's quite interesting looking at performance in that regard, because the game is actually running with an uncapped frame rate, and the results between base hardware and PS4 Pro are very similar. You can see that the game is targeting 30 frames per second, but doesn't often have that much leeway. For example, while the action can go up to around 50 frames per second, for the most part it hovers between 30 to 40 FPS, a kind of no man's land that doesn't really work in a V-synced presentation. 35 or 40 FPS just doesn't divide evenly into 60 the screen refresh, and that basically means we get plenty of judder on screen. And you can notice this from the frame time, where the engine is constantly going between 16 and 33 milliseconds. This explains the unevenness we were feeling when first playing the game. Initially I thought maybe we're looking at bad frame pacing, but instead it's just that the frame rate is running uncapped, there's no limit here. And this means that the gameplay experience just isn't as fluid or as stable as you'd expect for a 30 FPS title. In this case, the fix would be fairly simple. Apply a 30 FPS cap and that should solve most of the problems. After all, the game rarely has trouble hitting 30 frames per second at all. Occasionally there's like a 1 FPS dip just below 30 FPS, but otherwise there's the potential to get completely locked performance at 30 frames per second, and I think that would be something of a game changer here. While 30 FPS may not be a particularly high frame rate, as long as that is consistently delivered to the player, then action games can still be a lot of fun to play, just like DMC or Devil May Cry was on the last gen consoles. Currently there's no way around this issue on base PS4, but on the Pro it is indeed possible to have a far more stable experience, and you can do this by turning on the 60 FPS mode. This boosts the frame rate up to a mostly smooth 60 frames per second, and wow, it completely transforms the game. Combat feels more responsive and the experience just flows a lot better. Most of the judder present with the uncapped frame rate is completely eliminated, and what can I say? The additional stability just helps us to better connect with the action and allows us to get more lost in the world. Okay, sure, the game doesn't hit a perfect 60 FPS at all times, but to be honest, when the frame rate does drop, the gameplay doesn't feel overly compromised. Essentially, we're looking at between 50 to 60 FPS, which is actually very good, and in line with how the best Call of Duty games perform on consoles, at least during the campaign. The only aspect of performance that isn't improved is with regards to the stuttering that occurs periodically while playing. This is something that happens when moving from area to area, and it's not something that activating the 60 FPS mode will fix. Thankfully these stutters don't occur very often, so their intrusiveness on gameplay is fairly limited. But even so, the 60 FPS mode is still the best way to play Hellblade on console. However, there is a catch, and that comes with a pretty hefty drop in resolution. While base PS4 is mostly locked to 1080p, the 60 FPS mode on Pro regularly comes in at 900p, and there's the possibility of this dropping further in demanding action scenes. And that means that whether you're playing the game on a 4K screen or even a 1080p display, the 60 FPS mode looks softer than standard PS4, and indeed the 30 FPS mode on PS4 Pro. This means there's clearly less definition to fine details on screen, and the game definitely takes on a blurrier look. It's clear that this is a sub 1080p presentation we're looking at. Now in terms of playing the game on a full HD screen, I'd actually take the improved frame rate over the extra sharpness on base hardware, or indeed PS4 Pro, simply because the gameplay experience is much better with a more stable frame rate. And on a full HD screen, the difference between 900p and 1080p, although noticeable, is I guess a worthy compromise to get that extra fluidity in terms of the gameplay. But on a 4K screen, 900p can look really blurry, and it's a compromise that not everyone is going to want to make. So with that said, the experience is kind of variable on consoles. I think the best way to play Hellblade at the moment is definitely on PS4 Pro with the 60 FPS mode in check, but on a full HD screen, whereas the standard 30 FPS mode, well, could use some improvement. But ultimately this kind of situation could be avoided if Ninja Theory introduces a simple 30 FPS cap. Doing that will allow gamers that don't mind 30 FPS to take advantage of the extra resolution PS4 Pro provides. While the up to 1440p may not be a huge boost over the 1080p of the base hardware, it still looks a lot better than say 900p scaled up to 4K. So while 1440p may be disappointing on PS4 Pro, The PC version is said to be incredibly demanding, so it would be interesting to see just how close the PlayStation 4 version actually matches up to that. After all, we've been hearing reports that even a GTX 1080 Ti can't hit 4K 60, and that's something we'll definitely be taking a look at soon. But for now, I think I'll leave it there. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, don't forget to like and subscribe. As ever, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.